الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Thank you for joining me. This will be the fourth in our series of weekly lecture series themed around, or their theme being connected with the fast of Ramadan, preparing for Ramadan. And previously we spent some time discussing and reflecting on in great detail the ayat from Surah Al-Baqarah in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribed fasting. This week we would like to transition to another topic, and that is what in Arabic we would say muhimmatu siyami shahr Ramadan. So important matters or required knowledge related to the fasting in the month of Ramadan, or related to fasting in the month of Ramadan. So this is what we want to take and talk about today. When we did our series on the ayat from Surah Al-Baqarah, which prescribe fasting, we did talk about a lot of the ahkam. A lot of the ahkam were mentioned. A lot of the rules and regulations, the nuts and bolts, the do's and don'ts of fasting were mentioned in that discussion. And what is left, we will try to mention here. And then next week, which will probably be our last week before the month of Ramadan, we will just look at whatever else is pertinent. So what we're going to talk about today, basically, number one is haqiqatu siyam, the reality of fasting. Number two, ghayatu siyam, the objectives of fasting. Number three, what the fasting person needs to avoid. What the fasting person needs to avoid. And that can be divided into two categories. مَا يَحْرُمَ عَلَى الصَّائِمِ فِعْلُهُ, acts which are prohibited for the fasting person. And مَا يَكْرَهُ or مَا يُكْرَهُ لِلصَّائِمِ, what is undesirable or discouraged for the fasting person. So these are the things we'll look at today. We'll begin first and foremost with haqiqat as-siyam, the reality of fasting. If you look at the acts of worship in Islam, you'll find that they always have these arkan, they always have these pillars, these essential parts that without them you don't have the whole. The whole is considered invalid or non-existent. That's one thing that is consistent with the acts of worship in Islam. So for example, if you look at prayer, you'll have certain arkan, like for example, takbiratul ihram is a rukn, that the opening takbir, without it, you have no prayer. Al-Fatiha is a rukn. Without Al-Fatiha, as the Prophet said in the hadith of Ubadah ibn Samit, collected by Bukhari Muslim, he said, La salata liman lam yaqra bi fatihat al-kitab. There is no prayer for the one who does not recite Al-Fatiha. So this is another rukn, and so on and so forth. And this is the thing with all the acts of worship. They have these arkan. It's almost like you're baking a cake, and there are just some essential ingredients, and if you don't have those ingredients, you will not have a cake. And similarly, with the acts of worship, there are essential ingredients. Without them, you will not have the act of worship. So that said, a siyam, it has two essential arkan. It has two ruknan. It's basically two essential pillars, two essential ingredients. The first one is al-imsak, that you withhold, you refrain, you abstain. And you abstain from those things which will break the fast, and those things which will invalidate the fast. So the things which will nullify the fast and the things which will invalidate the fast. Al-mufattirat, the things which will break the fast, and al-mufsidat or mubtilat, those things which will nullify it. And obviously, in order to do that, you'll have to have knowledge. This requires knowledge. In order for you to abstain from the things which will break your fast or nullify it, you'll have to know what those things are. So al-imsak, that's the first pillar of fasting. The second pillar of fasting is an-niyyah, the intention. And yadullu alayhi, this is evidenced by the statement of Hafsa, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, and Ibn Umar, her brother, the son of Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhuma, in which they both said, and this statement of theirs is something which has the merit or the weight of a hadith. Why? Because they couldn't have said this without having heard it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what did they say? They said, "La siyama liman lam yafridhu min al-layl," that there is no fast for the one who does not have the intention from the night prior. So intention is an essential part of fasting. A person can withhold from eating and drinking and having relations all day long, but if they don't do that with the proper intention, with the intention to get the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of fasting, then they are not fasting. And so what this means, this is very important, is that there's no fast without intention, and there's no fast for the one who his intention is what? Is intermittent. Meaning at 1 minute he's fasting, and the next minute he's what? He's thinking about breaking his fast. I'm fasting. No, you know what? Maybe I'm not gonna. Okay, I'm gonna. If his niyyah is intermittent, that will break his fast, because the niyyah has to be constant throughout the fast. Also, if the person ya'zim, if the person basically resolves and establishes conviction in his heart that he's going to break his fast, even if he doesn't break his fast will be broken. Why? Because one of the essential arkan, one of the essential pillars of fasting is that a person has what? Has the niyyah, and that niyyah has to be consistent throughout the fast, or continuous throughout the fast. So that's the first thing, haqiqat siyam. This is very important, and we're going to see why later on as we get through some of the some of the mufsidat, things will break the fast. The next thing that we want to talk about is ghayat as-siyam, the objectives of fasting. And we'll mention 6, inshallah ta'ala. We'll mention 6 objectives of fasting. The first objective is at-taqwa. And this is the most important objective of fasting, as we saw when we studied the ayat in the past 3 weeks. One of the first ayah that we talked about was the ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 183, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu kutiba alaykum as-siyamu kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. O you who believe, fasting has been prescribed upon you as it was prescribed upon those who came before you, so that you would obtain at-taqwa. And so this is clearly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is explicitly mentioning that the objective of fasting, the reason why He prescribed it, is so that we would obtain this piety, this God consciousness, this fear of Allah. And this teaches us 2 things. One, that this is the most important objective of fasting. And the proof for that is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentioned it specifically. The second thing that we benefit from this statement, or this ayah in which He explicitly mentioned taqwa as a ghaya, as an objective of fasting, is that fasting is the best and most superior way to achieve this objective. Because if there were a better way to achieve it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have mentioned that way instead. طيب. The next objective, the second one, is that fasting is a way, or through fasting, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala differentiates between those who worship Him and those who do not worship Him, or those who worship Him and those who worship their desires. Fasting is a means to distinguish those who worship Allah from those who worship their desires. And one of the goals of the tashri'ah, one of the goals of the commands and the prohibitions and the law of Islam, the prescriptions of Islam, the rules and regulations of Islam, is to serve as a a means of distinction between those who worship Allah and those who worship their own desires. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, He says, I have not created jinkind and mankind except to worship me. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, when he made tafsir of this ayah, he said that Allah is saying, or what it means is, إِلَّا لِأَمُرَهُمْ وَأَنْهَاهُمْ, I have not created man and jinn except to command them and prohibit them. And through those commands and those prohibitions, it will become clear those who worship me and those who don't worship me. How is that? Because those who worship Allah will do what He commands and avoid what He prohibits. And those who don't, won't. So basically, One of the benefits of every act of worship, including fasting, everything that we've been ordered to do, is to distinguish those who worship Allah from those who worship their desires. The third benefit, or the third ghaya, I should say, objective of fasting, is that it is an indication, it is a means to reveal or to expose the integrity of a person's faith, the credibility, the sincerity of a person's faith, and also the extent of their love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their love of their Lord. And if you think about it, as the scholars have basically explained how this is that man, without question, he loves his food, he loves his drink, and he loves being intimate with his spouse. And so basically, if he abandons those things for Allah, it's a clear indication, one, that he believes in Allah. Because if he abandons them for Allah, he can't see Allah, it means that he believes there is an Allah, and that this Allah wants him to do this, and he's doing it for his sake. It's a clear indication of what? Of sidqi imanihi, of the integrity and the sincerity of his faith. It's also an indication of his love for Allah, that he loves Allah more than what? More than anything else, because he's sacrificing the things that he loves for the one that he loves even more. Number 4 from the objectives of fasting is that fasting is a means to purify the heart. And purity of the heart is a lofty aspiration and should be the goal of every believer in this life. Because the heart is the king of the body, and it is the center of everything. If the heart is good, everything else will be good. If the heart is bad, everything else will be bad. As the Prophet said in the hadith, collected by Bukhari Muslim, authority of Abi Hurairah, he said, "Ala fil jasadi mudghah." I'm sorry, it's the hadith of, it's not Abi Hurairah. This is the hadith of Nu'man ibn Bashir. He said, "Ala fil jasadi mudghah, إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب." He said, certainly there is in the body a lump of flesh, that if it is pure and sound and upright, the whole body will be pure, sound, and upright. Wherever the heart goes, so goes the heart. Wherever the heart goes, so goes the body. And if it is foul, and if it is corrupt, then the whole body will be foul and corrupt. As we said, as the heart goes, so goes the rest of the body. ألا وهي القلب. Certainly it is the heart. So this purity of the heart is something that all of us should be seeking to do. And any means that we're given that will help us to purify our hearts is a means that we should actively seek. And one of those means is fasting. As was mentioned by Abu Sulaiman ad-Darani, who was one of the scholars from the early period of Islam, he said, إن النفس إذا جاءت وعطشت صفى القلب ورق وإذا شبعت ورويت عمي القلب. He said the heart is pure and soft. He said the heart, when a person fasts and they're hungry and they're thirsty, their heart will become pure and soft, and it will easily absorb the truth like a sponge. But if the person's body is fed to its full and given drink to its satisfaction, the heart will be blinded. And this is true. The more we have of this dunya, the more we allow ourselves to consume, the more heedless we become. And when we're deprived of these things, the more mindful we become. And the time that we're living in right now is a clear example of that. Because you have people who basically, by their own admission, they are atheists, or they are agnostics, or they are people who they have a very nominal affiliation with their religion. Those people are starting to say, look, there's got to be more to life than just consumption. There's more to it. There's got to be a God. There's got to be a greater power, because we are so out of control right now. You actually hear these people who are, public figures and celebrities actually saying things like this, that because they're deprived of their freedom and their ability to be mobile, and the fear of contracting this disease and potentially dying from it has made them have to give up certain things that they love. That has made them what? More reflective and more mindful than when they had all those things and had access to all those things. And number 5 from the objectives is that one of the ghayat, one of the objectives of fasting is that is for us to learn to appreciate the bounties of Allah that we have, and to empathize with the poor and less fortunate, and that will lead to another ghaya, is for us to be what? To be more generous. So basically there are, I guess, two objectives rolled up into one. One is that we become more mindful of what we have and more mindful of the people who have not. And then that leads us to what? To be more generous towards them. And this is supported by the hadith of Bukhari and authority Ibn Abbas, in which he said, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود الناس بالخير وكان أجود ما يكون في رمضان. That the Prophet ﷺ was the most generous of people with the good things that he possessed. He was quick to what? To give. He had a very open. He was very open-handed, and he was the most generous that he would ever be throughout the year in the month of Ramadan. That basically Ramadan inspired him to be even more generous. This is one of the goals of fasting. And then last but not least from the goals of fasting, number 6, is that it is a means for us to attain self-control, self-discipline, and conquer our desires. It is a means for us to learn how to bridle our desires and be in control. Instead of ourselves our desires being in control of us, we are in control of our desires. We are holding the reins, and we are, basically pulling back when we need to pull back, and we're directing to the left when we need to direct to the left, and to the right when we need to direct to the right. We are in control, and our desires are not in control. And this is evidenced by the hadith by Bukhari Muslim on the authority of Abd'Llah ibn Mas'ud, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Ya ma'ashar al-shabab, man istata'a minkum al-ba'a falyatazawwaj. He said, O gathering, O assembly of young men, whoever amongst you has the financial means to get married, then let him get married. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ, and whoever does not have those means, فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ, then let him fast. فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ وَأَحْسَنُ لِلْفَرْجِ, because it is, when he mentioned marriage, he said, فَلْيَتَزَوَّجْ فَإِنَّهُ أَغَضُّ لِلْبَصَرِ وَأَحْسَنُ لِلْفَرْجِ. He said, whoever amongst you has the means financially to get married, let him get married, because it will help him to lower his gaze and guard his chastity. And then he said, فَلَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ, and whoever cannot do that, فَعَلَيْهِ بِالصَّوْمِ فَإِنَّهُ لَهُ وِجَاء, then let him fast, because that will help him to what? To control his desires, to basically control himself and not do anything which is prohibited. So this is another ghaya of fasting. It helps us to learn how to what? To have self-control, discipline, and to conquer our desires. So that was the second of the points that we wanted to cover tonight. The third point, which is the big one, is what the fasting person needs to avoid. What the fasting person needs or must avoid. And that we can divide into two categories. What the fasting person needs to avoid, two categories. The first one, acts which are prohibited to the fasting person. Acts which the fasting person absolutely cannot do, he is prohibited from doing. And the second one are acts which are considered discouraged practices, which can potentially diminish the reward for fasting, although they will not nullify the fast. So let's look at the first category, which is acts prohibited to the fasting person. And we can divide that category, that first category, we can divide into two categories. You have general prohibitions. You have general and you have specific. General prohibitions and specific prohibitions. Specific things that the fasting person cannot do under any circumstances. The general prohibitions are prohibited to the fasting and non-fasting person alike. When we talk about general prohibitions for the fasting person, means there's things that are prohibited for both the fasting and the non-fasting person. But what's specific, what is particularly concerning for the fasting person as it relates to these general prohibitions, is that they are even more prohibited. They are even more illegal for the fasting person. So everything prohibited to the non-fasting person is prohibited to the fasting person. So like, for example, lying, for example. Lying is prohibited for those who are not fasting. It's prohibited for those who are fasting. But the penalty for doing this, for lying, while a person is fasting, particularly in the month of Ramadan, the penalty is amplified and multiplied. So it is even more haram if a person lies in Ramadan while fasting. And this is evidenced by the hadith collected by Al-Bukhari Al-Bukhari, on the authority of Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, in which the Prophet said, "Man lam yada' qawl az-zur wal 'amal bihi wal jahl, falaysa lillahi haja an yada' ta'amahu wa sharaba." He said, whoever does not abstain from falsehood in word and deed, and ignorant behavior sins, then Allah has no need, does not want him to leave his food and drink. I'll say that again. He said, whoever does not abstain from falsehood in word and deed, and ignorant behavior sins, then Allah has no need, does not want him to leave his food and drink. Now, before commenting on the hadith in more detail, because there's a couple of points I want to bring out of the hadith shows the Prophet specifically mentioned qawl az-zur, lying, falsehood, as it related to what? To fasting. Although this is something which is prohibited for all people. Bearing false testimony, lying, and behaving ignorantly, committing sins, these are prohibited for all people. But the Prophet ﷺ, when it came to fasting, he specifically mentioned it as if to say, this is something which is even more serious for the fasting person. Not only that, he said that it is something that if he doesn't leave it while fasting, Allah doesn't need him to what? To leave his food and drink. Now, obviously, whether he tells the truth or doesn't tell the truth, avoid sin or commit sin, Allah doesn't need his fasting. So what does this Allah does not need, has no need for his fasting mean? The scholars of Islam have traditionally offered three interpretations for that. One is that these deeds are far more sinful when done by a fasting person. That's the first interpretation the scholars have given. That they're far more sinful. When a person lies while fasting, he's guilty of a greater sin than if he lied and he was not fasting. طيب. The second interpretation of the scholars is that it is as if he had not fasted. It will be as if he had not fasted, which is an allusion to Allah's refusal to accept his fast. When he says, فَلَيْسَ لِلَّهِ حَاجَةٌ, Allah has no need for his food and drink, it is as if he's saying it will be as if he didn't fast, or that Allah will not accept it. Now, when we say Allah will not accept it, that could have two possible meanings. And that goes back to what is al-qubul in ash-shara. What does it mean when Allah says that this deed has been accepted, this deed will not be accepted? It means two things. There are two levels to acceptance. The first level of acceptance of a deed by Allah is that basically when a person does a deed, for example, like a person prays Salat al-Dhuhr. When they pray Salat al-Dhuhr, they get the first level of qubul, which is basically a certificate of participation. They get credited with doing the deed, which is the opposite of being considered delinquent or negligent, that they haven't done it. So basically, whenever we do any deed of dhuhr, a person prays salat of dhuhr, then what happens automatically is that they get al-qubul on the first level, the first degree of al-qubul, which is basically Allah saying that this person gets credit for doing the deed, which is the opposite of being considered delinquent and having not done it. That's one type of qubul. The second level, and more important level of al-qubul, is a person receiving a reward. Some amount or weight of hasanat, of good deeds, which Allah will determine. It's fixed by Allah, depending on what? How good the deed was. Allah will give more or give less, depending on how well we perform the deed. As the Prophet said in the one hadith, when he talked about how a person will pray, and he may get tus'uha, or thumunuha, or sub'uha, or sudusuha. He'll pray, and he'll get a ninth of its value. He'll get an eighth of its value. He'll get a seventh of its value. He'll get half of its value. etc. The Prophet went on and on. He'll get this amount or that amount, but depending on how well he did it, that the amount of reward that he'll get will be determined by how well he did. That's the other type of qubul, the other type of acceptance. So when the Prophet said, it is as if he has not fasted, an allusion to Allah's refusal to accept his fast, if that's the interpretation, or one of the interpretations the scholars gave, what that means here is that they will get the certificate of participation. They'll get credit for doing the deed and will not be considered delinquent. But they won't get the reward, the thawab, the hasanat written in their record. But they won't come on the day of judgment and it'll be said you didn't fast Ramadan 2020 because you lied every day, or you were biting people's back, or you were gossiping. You were doing these haram things, and as a result, you didn't fast. That will not be said to the person. But what could possibly be said to the person, according to this interpretation of the scholars, is that the person gets what? Gets no tangible reward, no hasanat, no thawab for that deed. The last interpretation the scholars gave for this hadith is that it is an indication that the fast, although entitled to a reward, and when we mean reward here, the thawab, the hasanat, the reward earned is greatly outweighed by the sin earned by doing these deeds while fasting. That basically the person will get some reward, whatever Allah affixes for the deed. But he will also get with that sin. And the sin that he gets will greatly outweigh the good or the reward that he's given. So that was the general prohibitions. The general things or general prohibited deeds for the fasting person is every deed that's prohibited for a non-fasting person is prohibited for a fasting person, but the sin is multiplied for the one who is fasting. The second category of acts prohibited for the fasting person are those which are specifically prohibited for the fasting person. That they would be legal for him if he weren't fasting, if he were not fasting. And we will call these, or these are basically referred to by the scholars of Islam as mufsidat as-sawm, the things which will nullify and negate a person's fast, and therefore the person has to avoid them. Now, they are basically 9 in number, and we're going to add a 10th one, which is not haram, but it is a mufsid, it is a mubtil, it is a mufattir, if you will. It's something which will break the fast. And it's important for us to include it just for everyone's benefit, although this one that we're going to add, and we'll add, it'll be the 5th one in the list, is not really something which is prohibited, but it is something which does invalidate the fast, and so we need to mention it there. And we'll highlight it when we get to it specifically. So the first mufsid, the first fast breaker, if you will, is... But there's a question, can you please shed light on common sins which we all might indulge in without realizing? So it's a good question, and since we just talked about that hadith, we'll mention it ala ujala. So for example, not being truthful, which the Prophet specifically mentioned in the hadith. And then we're going to actually I'll hold off on that, because we're actually going to mention some of those under discouraged practices. So we're going to mention some of those under discouraged practices. So I will go into it under discouraged practices. I will talk about that in detail and give some examples. So let's go back now to mufsidat as-sawm. So these are the things that if you do them, the fasting person is prohibited from doing them, although if he were not fasting, they wouldn't be prohibited. But if he indulges in them while he's fasting, his fast will be what? Nullified. And so therefore there are acts prohibited specifically for the fasting person. Number 1, al-akl wa shurb, eating and drinking. ويدل ذلك, the ayah that we mentioned and we covered it extensively last week, كلوا واشربوا حتى يتبين لكم الخيط الأبيض من الخيط الأسود من الفجر ثم أتموا الصيام إلى الليل, where Allah says, and eat and drink until the white thread of dawn becomes clear from the dark thread or the black thread of night, and then at that point, the crack of dawn, continue fasting, which means what? Leave off eating and drinking until what? Until nightfall. So that is a clear indication that eating and drinking during the hours of the fast are prohibited. Like the second mufsid, the second action which is prohibited for the one who is fasting, is consuming anything, solid or liquid, through the mouth, and it's subsequently entering the throat and ultimately reaching the stomach. So this is important. Why? Because some people will put things in their mouth which are not considered food or not considered drink, and they'll say, I haven't eaten, and therefore I haven't broken my fast. So we have to understand that anything which is analogous to eating and drinking is also considered a mufsid, something which will break the fast. So for example, a person could take a rock and swallow it. Just feel like, look, I just need to, have that feeling of having something in my mouth and swallowing it, and that helps me get through the fast. Swallowing a rock, although there's no nutrition in it, and that rock is not going to benefit the person physically at all, and it's not food. That swallowing of the rock intentionally will break a person's fast. If a person, for example, went to the gas station and they were filling their car up and they were like, man, I'm so thirsty, I could drink gasoline. And they drink it. They actually drink it, right? And now, inshallah, no one would ever do this, but if they drink it and it could kill that person, that drinking of gasoline will do what? Will break the fast. Even though it's not food or drink, if you intentionally consume something through the mouth, it enters the throat and then reaches the stomach, that breaks your fast. So that's another mufsid lis-sawm. طيب. The third mufsid is intercourse. The third mufsid is intercourse or intimacy, a person being with their spouse. And this is proven by the ayah that we also covered last week. أُحِلَّ لَكُمْ لَيْلَةَ الصِّيَامِ الرَّفَثُ إِلَى نِسَائِكُمْ هُنَّ لِبَاسٌ لَكُمْ وَأَنْتُمْ لِبَاسٌ لَهُمْ. Lawful for you on the night of the fasts is going unto your wives. They are a garment for you and you're a garment for them. And what we call mafhum mukhalafa, if Allah says lawful for you on the night of the fasts are your is being with your spouses, we can understand from that the opposite meaning is also true. That during the daytime, being with your families is prohibited. We also have the hadith where the man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Ya Rasulullah, halaktu. He said, O Messenger of Allah, I've perished. I'm ruined. So the Messenger of Allah responded, he said, قَالَ وَمَا أَهْلَكَكَ. He said, and what has ruined you? He said, وَقَعْتُ عَلَى امْرَأَتِي فِي نَهَارِ رَمَضَانِ. He said, I was with my wife intimately during the daytime of Ramadan. And the Prophet أَقَرَّهُ. The Prophet tacitly approved of what he said, that yeah, this is trouble for you. And he proceeded to tell him how he could solve it. He said, are you able to free a slave? If you can't free a slave, are you able to fast 60 days? And if you can't do that, are you able to feed 60 people? He started telling him how to expiate for the sin he committed, which shows again that having relations with one's wife is a mufsid. It's something which breaks the fast, and it's also a major sin, something which the fasting person has to avoid. Type number 4 is basically anything which is analogous to being with one's family. That brings about what we would term as ejaculation. So as if a person does something, and that leads that person to what? To do what would happen if he were intimate, then that behavior is also a mufsid lis-sawm. It's also something which will break the fast. The fifth one, which is the one that I said I would highlight, and it is not something haram, but it's something which will break the fast, and we need to know that. And that is when a woman gets her what we call monthly visitor, or if she experiences childbirth and then following childbirth, postpartum bleeding. Those two things will nullify the fast. They will nullify the fast. And so it is considered min al-mufsidat, even though it's not from what? Al-muharramat. It's not from the prohibited things, obviously. It's not something the woman can control, but it is something which will break the fast. And this is supported by the hadith, by Bukhari and Muslim, on the authority of Abi Sa'id al-Khudri, in which the Prophet said, أَلَيْسَتِ الْمَرْأَ إِذَا حَاضَتْ لَمْ تُصَلِّ وَلَمْ تَصُمْ. He said, is it not so that when a woman is experiencing her monthly visitor, she does not pray and she does not fast? So basically, it is not correct for her to pray or fast while she's experiencing those two things, her postpartum bleeding or her monthly visitor. Now, here I want to warn the sisters specifically from something which is very common as it relates to these two circumstances. And the first thing is what we call batalat al-hayd. Batalat al-hayd. This is basically where a woman just becomes inactive. She becomes, for lack of a better word, she kind of takes it easy, if you will, while she is on her menses or experiencing her period during the month of Ramadan. And this is an error. The month of Ramadan is a month where we have to what? We have to actively seek the reward from Allah. And so therefore, we can't take days off. We can't just kick back and think, okay, my monthly visitor has come, and so I can just what? Take it easy until it leaves. No, we're still in the month of Ramadan, and there are lots of things that you can do even though you can't pray and you can't fast. So for example, a woman can read the Quran. She can actually read it from the Mus'haf, as long as she doesn't what? Touch the Mus'haf with her what? With her bare hands. So she can read from the Mus'haf with some type of what? Some type of cloth or something between her hands and the actual Mus'haf. She can read. She can also read the Quran by heart. That whatever she's memorized, she can read that. There is no sin on that, or is no sin in that. Also, she can read the Quran from a translation and transliteration. So basically, there are many of the sisters, Arabic is not their original language. Their original language might be English, it might be French, it might be Urdu, it might be whatever. And so they have these copies of the Quran, which is dual language, Arabic and their first language or their original language. They can read that all day long because that's not considered a Mus'haf. So they can read that all day, all night. Also, they can engage in what? Sadaqah, which is another thing we're encouraged to do, as we mentioned the hadith of Ibn Abbas, that the Prophet was most generous in Ramadan. They can still give sadaqah and zakat and give charity and alms and do voluntary charity during Ramadan, even if they're experiencing their periods. Also, a dhikr. You don't have to be in a state of purity to remember Allah. As Aisha, she mentioned, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يذكر الله على كل أحيانه. That the Prophet ﷺ used to mention Allah in every circumstance. Regardless of what his condition and state was, he would mention Allah. Also a dua, you can call upon Allah. Even if you're not in a state of tahara, you can call upon Allah and make dua. And these are things that the sisters can do actively while they're on their periods. And so this is important, that they just don't kind of like kick back and take it easy until they're able to pray again. But rather, even in those off days, they should be actively, and when they can't pray, they're making more dua, they're making more dhikr, etc., and so on. The second thing I wanted to mention as a tanbih, as it relates to this point, is that a woman has to be very keen to count the days that she missed. Very keen, even if you have to mark it on the calendar, because what happens sometimes is that we're not keeping track. And then Ramadan comes and goes, and a few months come and go. Maybe wait to the winter months when the days are shorter to make up those fasts, and we're trying to recollect. And who's going to try to get into our head and tell us that the number is smaller than we think it is? The shaitan. And what ends up happening is that maybe a woman missed 7 days or 8 days, and she convinces herself that she only missed 5. So what happens? What happens to those other 2 or 3 days? That's a debt that she owes to Allah, and she meets Allah with that debt. And so she has to be very keen to track the days and to count them down and make sure that she makes up whatever she missed due to her menstrual periods. The last thing I want to mention as it relates to this is that that whatever time the period or the postpartum bleeding happens, immediately the fast will be broken. And sadly to say, even if that happened 1 or 2 minutes before Salat al-Maghrib. So even if the woman pretty much fasted the whole day except for a few minutes, a few moments sometimes, and the period comes before Salat al-Maghrib, before the sunset, then unfortunately that day is nullified, and she has to count that day as one that she has to make up. But going on with the list of al-mufsidat, the things which will break the fast, is being intent or resolving to break the fast. Al-azam al-fitr. Remember we said earlier that one of the rukn, one of the pillars of fasting is a niyyah. So anytime that niyyah is broken, even if it's broken for a short period of time, once you make up your mind you're going to break your fast, you start heading toward that water fountain. Even if you get to the water fountain, you say, no, you know what? I'm not going to do it. Once you made that determination and you resolve yourself to break your fast and you broke the niyyah, even if you didn't physically break the fast is broken. You have to have the niyyah continuously throughout the fast. Number 6 is if you have indecision and if you're wavering between continuing and discontinuing the fast. As we said, the niyyah has to be continuous. It has to be continuous. It cannot be intermittent. So you have to be firmly resolved on continuing the fast. The 7th one is intentional vomiting. Intentional vomiting. If a person intentionally vomits, not they vomit due to illness, unintentionally, unwittingly. But if they do it intentionally, purposefully, then their fast will be broken. And this is evidenced by the hadith of Abd'Llah ibn Umar, which has the weight, it's the statement of Ibn Umar, which has the weight of a hadith in which Ibn Umar, he said, "Man dara'ahu al-qay, fala shay alayh, wa man istaqa'a fa alayhi al-qada." He said that whoever is overcome by vomiting, then he can continue fasting. His fast is what? Is still valid. And whoever intentionally vomits, then he has to what? He has to make up that day. Also number 8, which is not really a common practice, but it is still something practiced, which is cupping and getting cupped. Now obviously here we generally don't do it, but in other parts of the world they do still do this, bloodletting. And bloodletting is something which will break the fast for the one who does it and the one who has it done. And this is evidenced by the hadith in which the Prophet said, aftar al-hajim wal-mahjum. The one who did the cupping and the one who got cupped, both of them, their fast is broken. Let me see. And last but not least, la samahallah, may Allah protect us from may Allah protect all of us from this, is apostasy. If a person leaves Islam during the fast while fasting, that day of fasting will be nullified. Even if they return to Islam later on that day, that day would be nullified. طيب. So that was all of the mufsidat as-sawm, the things which will break the fast, and the things which the fasting person must avoid. A total of 10 in number. But let's go now to discouraged practices, and this will answer the question of the sister on Facebook. So there are certain discouraged practices, things which that might need some intervention. Can they make that niyyah since beginning? Then they will need to do kafara second if someone has, let me see. So what dream is fast broken? طيب. Okay, so let me deal with these one by one. So let's deal with the first one, which is some of those things which people need to avoid, and a lot of times we're not mindful of them, but they are sins which can either break the fast, totally nullify it, or they can diminish the reward. So one of them we mentioned earlier, we'll mention again here: lying, bearing false witness or testimony, ignorant behavior, and being foolish. As we mentioned the hadith earlier, man lam yada' qawl az-zur wal 'amal bihi wal jahl falaysa lillahi haja an yada' ta'amahu wa sharaba. That's the hadith of Abi Hurairah al-Bukhari, in which he said that whoever does not abandon speaking falsely or falsehood in word and deed and behaving ignorantly, then that person, Allah has no need that they should leave their food and drink. Also another one which is very common now, included in al-jahl, sin, is things like gossiping, carrying tales, backbiting. All those things are included, and these are things that are very common amongst the Muslims. They're very common amongst the Muslims, and a lot of people do it without even realizing that they're doing it. So it's very pertinent to what the sister mentioned earlier, that the sins that we commit commonly and we don't realize, and they can diminish the reward of our fast. Backbiting is one of them. And a lot of times when people are not able to eat food, they substitute eating food by eating flesh, talking about other people. And it's something which is very common amongst the Muslims, even though it's something which is a major sin. As Ahmed, he said that if what was the statement exactly? Basically what he said, the meaning of it is that if people were prohibited from talking, if they If they were to backbite, then no one would speak. No one would talk. It's such a common thing amongst the Muslims. And so this is something we had to be very mindful of. Speaking about others behind their back in a negative way, this is something we need to be very keen to avoid while fasting in Ramadan. Another one under the reward diminishers is mouthing obscenities, using foul language, speaking indecently, being argumentative, or engaging in verbal abuse. And this is evidenced by the hadith of Bukhari Muslim, on authority of Abu Hurairah also, in which he said, "As-sawmu junnah," in which the Prophet said, "As-sawmu junnah." He said, fasting is a shield. فَإِذَا كَانَ يَوْمُ صَوْمِ أَحَدِكُمْ. So if one of you is fasting, فَلَا يَرْفُثْ وَلَا يَسْخَبْ. Then let him not speak indecently or argue with anyone. Another thing too is that a lot of times tempers start to run high in Ramadan. People are not able to eat. They're a little bit, maybe they're not able to have their coffee. Some people are smokers and not able to have their cigarettes. And so those people become a little bit uptight. They become very tense. And their fuse becomes very short. And they tend to do what? They tend to, when their buttons are pushed, they become argumentative. They become verbally abusive, etc. These are things that the Prophet ordered us specifically to avoid. And they will, if a person engages in them, their fast will still be valid, but their reward for their fast will be diminished. Also, in general, every behavior which contradicts the spirit of fasting and contradicts the pursuit of piety. So basically, when we're fasting, we are supposed to observe a level of decorum which is above and beyond the decorum that we observe when we're not fasting. And the proof for this is what we mentioned last week, the statement of Jabir ibn Abd'Llah, in which he said, وَلَا يَكُونُ يَوْمُ صَوْمِكَ وَيَوْمُ فِطْرِكَ سَوَاءً. Do not let your days of fasting and your days of not fasting be the same. There should be a marked and distinct difference between the days when you're fasting in terms of what your behavior, your character, your decorum, etc. And so this is critical. And if we don't do that, that can diminish the reward for our fasting. And then there's a second level of discouraged practices, which are purely precautionary. And there's a general qaida that the scholars have given, and that is that anything that exposes the fast to being broken, this thing will not break the fast, but it puts the fast in risk of being broken, then doing that thing is makruh. It is disliked and discouraged, but is not prohibited. And some examples that the scholars give of this category of discouraged practices is gathering saliva in the mouth and then swallowing it. Gathering saliva in the mouth is not something, and swallowing it is not something that will break your fast, but is discouraged. Why? Because it exposes the fast to being broken. The second one they give is tasting food. Tasting food is allowed. It is permitted. As we find the hadith of Ibn Abbas, the Prophet ﷺ allowed it, the tasting of food, but it's something discouraged. Why? Because if a person puts the spoon to his mouth, tastes it, and spits it out, that's well and good. But what if they accidentally what? They accidentally swallow it, okay? Or they're tasting and they basically get so taken by the taste of the food, they actually go ahead and intentionally swallow it. Because that's something dangerous, it's discouraged, although it is permitted. Another example is there are types of gum common in the Arab and Muslim world which do not decompose when they're chewed. They are not particularly tasty, but they are common in the Arab world. And those gums which do not decompose, it's almost like if a person took a rubber band and put it in their mouth and just chewed on it. That's permissible. But this is something which exposes the fast to being broken, although it itself is not a fast breaker. Why? Because a person could accidentally swallow it, or without thinking they might swallow it. So because it exposes the fast to being broken, it's something which scholars discourage, although it's not prohibited. And last but not least, al-qubla wa taqbil, kissing without mubashara. If a man kisses his wife on the cheek or vice versa, or on the lips without a lot of embracing and caressing, that is permissible, but it is something which could potentially expose the fast to being broken, because one thing could lead potentially to another. And so it is discouraged generally, but it is permitted. That said, we'll circle back. So the sister asked the second question, said, Someone has some condition that might need some medical intervention. So can they make the niyyah from the beginning? Then they will need to do kafara. So yes, basically, if a person thinks that potentially something will happen in Ramadan that will require some type of medical intervention that will cause them to have to suspend the fast, then they begin the month fasting. And they make the niyyah to fast the whole month. And every night they renew the niyyah. And then if something happens, then when that thing happens and their situation changes, then they what? They act accordingly. So if whatever intervention is done makes them in the category of al-marid, the one Allah mentioned in 2 of the ayat from Surah Al-Baqarah. For example, he said, فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْكُمْ مَرِيضًا أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرٍ. Whoever amongst you is ill or on a journey, then he should do what? Make up those days that he missed from other days, once that condition changes. So let's say for the sake of argument, that a person did 20 days of Ramadan. And then on the 20th, the 21st day, they had some type of surgery. And that surgery prohibited them from being able to continue fasting. But the condition will subside. Whatever condition prompted by the surgery, or that prompted the surgery, or whatever therapy and treatment followed the surgery, that ultimately will end. And they will return to health. Let's say a month, 2 months, 3 months after Ramadan. Then they make up those 10 days at that time. Suppose whatever intervention was done made it such that they can never fast again. Let's say. Then yes, they would make the kafara. They would feed for every day that they missed a poor person. That's how they would do that. The second question she asked is if a person has a wet dream, does that break their fast? No. That does not break the fast because it is not something that was done. It's not something that was brought about because of an action that they did. So if it's a wet dream, that will not require them to, that will not invalidate the fast or cause them to have to make up the fast. But if it's something, if that ejaculation occurs because of something that they did to themselves or they did with their partner, then that would be something that they have to make up the day. But not in the case, it does not break the fast if it happens inadvertently, unwittingly, and due to no fault or action of their own. Another question. This one's a little bit off topic, but it says, the rest of my family is Christian. How to explain in simple terms what Ramadan is? So I think we kind of covered this in one of the previous lectures, but we'll mention it again ala ujala quickly. So basically, if a person were trying to explain to non-Muslims what Ramadan is, you would just say it is a month of fasting and a month of drawing close to Allah through fasting and other good deeds. And fasting basically is that we abstain from primarily 3 things: food, drink, and intercourse with our partners. And we do that from sunup to sundown. That's basically Ramadan in a nutshell. And that lasts for 29 or 30 days, depending on the length of the month, because we're on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. You don't have to go into a bunch of details, but Ramadan in a nutshell is basically, it's a month of drawing close to Allah through fasting and other acts of devotion. And fasting in Islam is abstaining from primarily 3 things: food, drink, and intercourse. And we do that from the crack of dawn till sunset every day until the end of the month of Ramadan. That's basically what it is, and that's very simple terms. And then she said, a common question I get is, isn't Islam and Muslim 2 separate things? Best way to explain this: Islam is the religion, Muslim is the follower of the religion. It's just like Christianity and Christian. So if you're talking to Christians, talk to them in their terms. So if they say to you, for example, is Islam and Muslim the same thing, or are they different things? You could say, and you wouldn't be saying it to be you wouldn't be saying to be patronizing, but you would just say, is Christian and Christianity the same thing? And they'll say, no, no, no. Christianity is a religion. Christian is the person who follows a religion. And you say it's the same thing. Islam is the religion, and Muslim is the one who follows the religion. And then one last question. It says, my postpartum will interfere with Ramadan. I'm 3 weeks out, and we'll still have another 3 to go. Will I have to make these days up? Yeah, for postpartum, it depends. If you are breastfeeding, then you can feed a poor person for every day that you are not fasting in Ramadan. But if you are feeding by the bottle, then those days that you missed, you'll have to make those days up at a later time once the postpartum subsides. So let's say, for example, 3 weeks of your bottle feeding, you're not breastfeeding, 3 weeks pass, and then you start fasting the final week. 7 days of Ramadan you fast. 21 days you didn't fast. Well, actually, more than 21 days. It'll be like 23 days, okay, that you didn't fast. So then you are free to make those days up throughout the year, and you don't have to make them up consecutively, and you have the freedom to choose. So if you wanted, you could wait until the winter months when the days are a lot shorter, and you can make it up then. It will be easier. But yeah, if you're not breastfeeding, then yes, you will have to make up those days. But the pregnant and breastfeeding women are excused from making up the days and are allowed to actually do what? To make kafara, to actually expiate by feeding a poor person for each day. If there are no further questions, then we will conclude with that. And inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll talk about a few other things related to fasting, perhaps a little bit more of the spiritual side of it, and a few other important sunan, important things that will increase the reward of fast that we should do. Why can you not fast during bottle feeding during postpartum? Because an-nifas, the postpartum bleeding, is something which prohibits a woman from fasting, just like her menstrual period prohibits her from fasting. So one of the requirements for a person to fast, in the case of a woman, is that she is free of these two flows of blood, either the menstrual bleeding or the postpartum bleeding. If she's experiencing either one of those, then she's not allowed to fast, because basically when it comes to the acts of worship, Allah determines what state a person has to be in for that act of worship to be accepted. And Allah has basically prescribed that a woman has to be free of either of these flows of blood to be in a state where it's suitable for her to fast. At the end of the day, we'll have to worship Allah on His terms. We have to come to Him with our worship in the way that He considers it to be what? Acceptable. It's like, for example, if a person went for a job interview and he's applying for this job. He wants to get accepted by the company. And there's a certain understanding that when you come to a job interview for this type of job, you have to wear a certain type of clothing. And if you don't wear that clothing, you won't get the job. They won't take you seriously, and in fact, they may be insulted by the way you came. And that will cause them what? To not accept you, even if you're what? Very qualified, and you fulfill all of the requirements and have all the credentials and experience needed for the job. Similarly, when we worship Allah, we have to come to Him in the way that He will accept. Who determines what way that is? He does, because at the end of the day, it's His acceptance that we want. And so if Allah says, I will accept the fast of the person who fulfills these conditions, and among them, that they are free of either or both of these flows of blood. So I will accept the fast of a woman who is free from menstrual bleeding and free from postpartum bleeding. Then that's the way we have to come to Him. We have to come to Him in that way in order for our fast to be accepted. And Allah has mentioned on the tongue of His Prophet that there are two states or two circumstances that will render the fasting of a woman unacceptable. One of them is if she has this menstrual bleeding, and one of them is if she has postpartum bleeding. As the Prophet said in the hadith, he said, أَلَيْسَتِ الْمَرْأَةِ إِذَا حَاضَتْ لَمْ تُصَلِّي وَلَمْ تُصُمْ. Is it not so that a woman, when she is experiencing one of these flows of blood, that she should not pray and she should not fast? And if your question is, well, why is that? Well, why is that? Again, when it comes to the acts of worship, there isn't always an answer to why. Because the acts of worship are something which are determined by God. And God doesn't have to explain to us why we have to come to him a certain way. He just tells us how we have to come, and we're expected to comply. And one of the wisdoms behind this is that it's a way to test the people. Because if a person really truly believes in God and his right to be worshipped alone on his terms, that person will do as God says, even if they don't know why, or there's no reason or wisdom or justification provided for that. So if Allah justifies everything, he's not testing us in this way. And so sometimes he tells us, do this, and this is why. And in many cases, he tells us, do this, and he doesn't tell us why. To test those, to see who are those who really submit and surrender unconditionally. I hope that answers the question. And with that, we will conclude. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.